Good. Well, thank you all for joining us very promptly for this morning's roundtable briefing. My name is Neil Darks. I'm one of the co-founders of Longevity Leaders. I'm also the tech manager for this briefing roundtable. So any issues with questions or queries over the course of the hour, then obviously please do direct them to me privately through private chat. I'll also be admitting people throughout the session so that obviously we keep getting a good flow of people involved in the session. And I guess with all roundtables, the beauty of these things are the interactivity. So obviously we do ask that everybody does try and get involved as much as possible and ask questions, and let's get a good debate going. The session of this roundtable is on aging science, and the format of the session, we will have a trend host and an impact host. I'm delighted to say that Lynne Cox, Associate Professor at University of Oxford, is our trend host for this session. And joining Lynne is Suthan Rajagopalan, who is a partner at Mercer, and Sud is our impact host. Now for this 60-minute session, we're going to be running as follows. For the first 3 to 5 minutes, we'll be doing brief introductions. So the idea is just to spend 30 seconds introducing yourself, your company, your organization, and obviously your interest in this field. We'll then move on to Lynne, who will present for 10 minutes with slides on her presentation. We'll then be holding ideally questions over for the end of that presentation, at which point Sud will kick in as the impact host for the group discussion. We'll then take forward 30 minutes of Q&A. There'll be some questions directly from Sud, and then obviously an opportunity for everybody to get involved with their own questions. And then we'll wrap up with roughly 10 minutes of summaries and any outcomes that anybody wants to discuss. Now, to get the best from this session, I've dropped in the chat function, ideally how we can hope to run this effectively. First and foremost, if you could all please try and change your name and company on your profile picture, so at least we know who you are. So when Sud or Lynne are referring to you, we can see your name and at least your company. All you need to do is click on your name or whatever your number is on your profile picture, and you can rename yourself there. If you would like to ask questions throughout the course of the session, then there's 2 ways to do this. If you were to click on your name on your participant list, there is a little raise hand emoji that will give a little blue hand that appears in your profile photo, and then Sud knows that you would like to ask a question, and then we can unmute you and allow you to ask that question personally. Alternatively, you can fire me an email question in the private chat function, and I will send that to Sud, and then Sud will bring that into the conversation as we go on. So hopefully that's all clear. Obviously, fire me a question, or if you have any concerns over the course of the session, again, you can privately email me in the private chat. But for the moment, if you have any further questions, then we look forward to getting the session going. And on that case, then I'd like to firstly pass over the baton to our trend host, Lynne Cox.
Good morning. It's lovely to see you all here. So just a very short bit about me. I'm a biogerontologist at the University of Oxford, and that means that I study basic underlying molecular and cellular mechanisms of aging. Our aim, obviously, is to try and improve health and well-being throughout the life course, but particularly in older people. I trained as a cancer biologist, and you'll find a lot of people in the aging field, people like Gigi Campisi, Manuel Serrano, they've all come from a cancer background because cancer and aging are pretty much flip sides of the same thing. So once I moved to Oxford, I shifted into aging science. So that's about 24 years ago. And I've got a particular interest in cell aging and in using model systems to try and look at aging across the whole life course, because we can't really do whole longitudinal studies in people in the time frame it takes to do scientific experiments. So we work on worms and flies. And human cells in culture, as well as obviously collaborating with colleagues who have human patients. So essentially that's me. You'll hear a bit more. I've only put one of my own data slides in, you'll be pleased to know, because I'm giving an overview of the whole field rather than trying to just sell our own science. So yeah, at the end, feel free to ask me anything. I'm not a population expert, I'm more a cell biologist, but obviously I've been in the field long enough to have picked up something about the aging space. Okay, so Sud, over to you.
Can you hear me? Yeah, checking here. Suthan Rajagopalan. I'm a partner at Mercer in their risk transfer area. I've got over 20 years experience with mainly defined benefit pension funds, but also working with insurers and reinsurers, investment banks. In the last 14 years, I've focused on risk transfer work and transferred around £25 billion worth of liability longevity risk from pension funds to insurers and reinsurers. So that's me in a nutshell. I was going to then sort of go through everyone. We've got quite a large number now. We've got about 12 people join. So shall I start with Mark Flint? Do you want to introduce yourself briefly?
Yeah, so I work for SCOR. I'm head of research for the longevity business in SCOR.
Thank you. Thank you. Is it Sasha?
Hi there, I'm Sasha Damani. I'm a longevity actuary, and I'm the current chair of the IFOA's MRSC.
Thank you. Mark.
Thanks. Yeah, I'm Mark Cooper. I'm the head of longevity risk at Rothsay Life, so pension risk transfer company. Sure.
Thank you. Larissa?
Hi, I'm Larissa. I'm running a startup company, and we're developing an ingredient which we want to put into food and beverage, which on the daily basis would improve the aging in the brain because it's against dementia and it elevates the ATP level. So basically we're developing it.
Thank you. Paul Rogers.
Hi there. Just frantically changing my name. It was coming up as Gemma Rogers' name, so just managed to do that. Director of Pension Risk at BT. Good morning, all.
Thank you, Paul. Platon, saying that correctly?
I'm an economist from Greece, and I'm interested in aging and sort of in an interdisciplinary way. Thanks.
Thank you. Anne Bellian. Hi, Neil. Anne might still be on mute. Sorry, yes, Anne.
You're now. Thank you. I'm Andinian. I have established a company called Rejuvenate Biomet. We're working on repurposed products which we combine for synergistic effects. We're now ready to move into the clinic. We're taking a little bit the traditional approach, taking first one indication, then next another indication for that first compound, and hoping to help the field to move forward and create additional human data on multiple biomarkers. Thank you.
Thank you. Then the next few don't have cameras. I don't know if people can put their cameras on if they're not on already. So we've got Guy Louis.
Hi, I'm Guy Louis. I currently run a startup in an unrelated field. I've been part of the aging sort of bubble for a while, though. I guess at the moment I'm just sort of a very interested party.
Thank you, Guy. So then I think we've got Nico Lynn Lau.
Hi, can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Hi. So I also have a startup that has a biomarker for biological age based on glycomics. So yeah, I only just jumped in and I definitely can't put my camera on, but I just want to listen in really.
Perfect, thank you. Got Chris Ballard at PIC.
Hi, I'm Chris. I'm a longevity actuary at PIC, a pension risk transfer insurance company. I'm also chair of the IFOA longevity membership interest group.
Thank you, Chris. Barry Sharples.
Hi, Suthan. I'm from Microgen, a small biotech business developing stem cell secretion products for degenerative and inflammatory conditions.
Thank you, Barry. Petra Schramek.
Yeah, sure. Thank you. Hello, everyone. So I'm a managing partner of Longevity Tech Fund. It's a kind of a small or longevity-focused and seed and pre-seed focused fund in this field.
Thank you. So I think Suthan Rajagopalan, so I'm not probably doing justice to that. Suthan?
Hi everyone, sorry, I didn't put my camera on. I was working for the pharma industry actually for a number of years and joined the longevity holding Rejuveron until the last month. I'm currently trying to put together a startup company within the longevity field.
Thank you. John Housley, please. I think John might be on mute, Neil.
Just trying. There we go.
Sorry.
Hi. I'm John Housley. I'm a group leader at the Abraham Institute in Cambridge. So basically I'm an academic and we do quite a lot of aging research.
Thank you. And Jose Cordeiro.
Yes, I am connected from Spain, and I am an engineer from MIT working now on biotechnology and promoting rejuvenation technologies. And that is my latest book, The Death of Death.
Thank you. And I think finally we've got George. Is that George McGuinness? Do you want to introduce yourself, please?
Hi, yes, I'm George Moose. I'm the Challenge Director for the UK Government's Healthy Ageing Challenge, which is a £98 million investment in sort of supporting people to live healthier and more independent lives.
Thank you, George. So have I covered everyone? I think I have, and there's a good sort of 15 guests. So we're very pleased. So I'll hand back to Lynne then.
Bear with me on the tech. Sorry, I even forgot to unmute myself. So what I'm going to do is share my screen. I hope this works. If it doesn't, just wave madly and I'll try and notice. So in the next 10 minutes, I'm going to go through what I think are the highlights of what's happening in the aging space. Now, let's just see. Is that working? Wave if it's working. Have we got slides? No? Right, okay. Yes, excellent, thank you. Right, okay. So I've tried to identify what I think are some of the trends in aging science, but actually I'm going to start in a slightly different place by trying to identify what we mean by longevity and what we're after when in longevity science. And okay. So what do we mean by longevity? And at the moment, what happens is our health deteriorates with age. So we have health during youth and then it deteriorates as we get older and eventually you end up dead. And that's because of all the different diseases associated with aging. As you can see here, you can get one or many different diseases as you get older. And if we actually tackle individual diseases, so say we eliminate cancer entirely, which would be wonderful, what we'll still do is be susceptible to other diseases of aging. So you might extend lifespan, but your health will still deteriorate. So is it lifespan that we're aiming for, or is it health span? And health span is where you stay happy and healthy essentially all the way through your life. You don't see this gradual deterioration until you hit essentially a cliff, fall off it, and that's it, curtains. But you're happy throughout most of your life. And that will inevitably, if you're not dying of disease, you're going to live longer. So that will have a longevity dividend, but hopefully a positive longevity dividend where you're in good health until the end. So how do we go about shifting from this morbid period where we have a lot of diseases in later life to a happy old age? And to do that, we have to understand what's going on with aging and what drives it. And obviously, the thing that everybody associates with aging is the passage of time. So the passage of chronological time, but also biological time. And then our bodies are exposed to chemicals that are harmful, so pollutants from the atmosphere, but also chemicals that we ourselves produce. So as we go about metabolizing, generating energy, breaking down our food, we also generate chemicals that can harm us. And then stress. And we all think of stress as being, I'm in a panic, I've got a deadline. But stress is actually also long-term chronic low-grade psychosocial stresses, as well as cellular stresses, damages that are happening within the cell, pressures on the cell, that all together can lead to something called cellular senescence or cell aging. Okay, now senescent cells are not good for you as you get older. So they accumulate as you age, and they accumulate faster in people who age more quickly with premature aging diseases. And that's all correlative data suggesting that they're bad. But some causative data came out not long ago showing that if you inject senescent cells into young mice, they age prematurely. They get multiple different diseases associated with aging. So senescent cells cause harm in many different ways. One of the most important is they generate a state of chronic inflammation and tissue damage, essentially little fires all through your body. They also fail to recycle worn out stuff, so they clog up with rubbish. And they show altered gene and cellular function. And there's a protein I'm going to come back to called mTOR. And essentially in old cells, it's as if the tap has been left running. So you've got this hyperfunction within the cell. And then you may often have heard of senescent cells as being zombies. They sit around not having the decency to die, but they also generate a zombie-like state in surrounding cells. And then finally, and particularly relevant to the situation we're in now, the immune system of the body also undergoes senescence, and that makes older people very much more vulnerable to any infectious pathogen that's around. Okay, now that's really depressing. So let's look on the bright side. Let's find out what the good news is. And the good news is that we're actually a long way ahead already in aging science in terms of working out what we can do about senescent cells and aging more generally. So there's many different therapeutic ways of tackling cell senescence. So here we've got a young cell with the passage of time and all those cellular stresses becoming a senescent cell. And one way of thinking about the problem is let's just stop that cell becoming senescent in the first place. Let's avoid it from even getting old. And some groups are looking at activating an enzyme called telomerase that essentially halts the biological clock, the counting mechanism that tells a cell when to age. Now, some of the data are very positive. I just urge caution because that's also the way that cancer cells forget how old they are and carry on proliferating. So just be very careful in that particular space. An alternative, if your cells have essentially run out of steam, why not simply replace them with off-the-shelf stem cells? And I'll mention this later on. Another alternative is to damp down all that inflammatory and damaging signaling, which is called the senescence-associated secretory phenotype. So we can have drugs that modify the SASP. And also, we can modify at a broader level the whole cell behavior of that old cell using xenomodifiers. So these drugs can either delay the onset of senescence, or we've got some that can actually start to reverse the process and make older cells behave as if they were younger. And then finally, if senescent cells are so bad, why not simply just get rid of them? And this is where the field is going in quite a big way, looking at senolytics, drugs that will lyse senescent cells and kill them. So let's look first at senolytics and what happens when you kill senescent cells. Here's some data from Peter de Keyser, who set up a company called Clearer Biotech, looking at the effect on prematurely aging mice. This poor mouse is quite sick and old and not very happy. And shortly after being given a drug that kills senescent cells, it regrows its fur, it runs around, it's happy, it's a lot healthier. And other labs around the world have been looking at this. So Darren Baker and Jan van Dersen have been looking in normal mice, so not prematurely aged mice, but normal mice, increasing the median lifespan by 27%. And then Laura Niederhofer has looked at treating quite late in life with a drug called fisetin that increases mouse lifespan. And this is not just lifespan, it's health, and it's health across the board in all the tissue and organ systems. Something that's really interesting and exciting is these mice behave as if they're younger. They're curious, they're inquisitive, they engage with their environment, they run around much more, and they show improved cancer survival. So there's whole body improvement from removing senescent cells. Obviously, this is very exciting. It's moved quite quickly into human clinical trials. And so Unity Biotech, so Nathaniel David and Judy Campisi are on yesterday talking about, Ned was talking about his pipeline UBX101 for osteoarthritis, which is now moving to phase 2 for treating painful knee arthritis. They've also got some assets enabling stage for macular degeneration and diabetic retinopathy. And then the Mayo Clinic have published positive results in idiopathic lung fibrosis using a combination of drugs. This is a natural product derived essentially from the oak tree, and dasatinib is an anti-cancer kinase inhibitor. So these are drugs that are already around, and they're being repurposed and combined as senolytics. So multiple different indications of aging, diabetic kidney disease, skeletal senescence, Alzheimer's, are all looking like they might be amenable to treatment through killing senescent cells. And then if you don't kill senescent cells, you can still modify their behavior using senomodifiers. And I mentioned mTOR as being that tap left on, so hyperfunction within senescent cells. And if you inhibit mTOR, you can improve lifespan and health. So this was discovered quite a while ago now, 11 years ago. Harrison et al. Published that rapamycin feeding to mice, it's an mTOR inhibitor, increased their lifespan by about 11%. Arlen Richardson then went on to show that in an Alzheimer mouse, which has a lot of amyloid in the brain, rapamycin treatment to inhibit mTOR leads to a loss of the amyloid, so a much better brain structure and increased blood flow to the brain, which also correlated with these mice having better cognitive functions. So functional improvement in an Alzheimer model of, in a mouse model of Alzheimer's disease. And now that's moved to a big companion dog aging project run by Matt Carbeline, who's got 20,000 dogs, or will be recruiting 20,000 pet animals. And already in their early stage studies, they've shown that rapamycin treatment improves heart health in these dogs. So this is moving forwards through experimental model organisms and close towards the clinic. So where do we go next from this? I've obviously been doing some crystal ball gazing, all the actuaries and pension people out there, I'm sure you do this for a living. It's quite hard to see a long way into the future, but I actually think we don't have to look too far. I actually think that the future is almost on us, or even is here now. And particularly with mTOR inhibitors, it's looking extremely promising in the aging space. So this is data from my own lab where we've got some senescent cells we've treated with an mTOR inhibitor that essentially rejuvenates and makes them look and behave younger. And it increases their lifespan very significantly. They don't hit the senescence barrier. They carry on growing and dividing, but importantly, without any sign of neoplastic or cancerous change. And recently, Chung et al. Have published a paper showing that rapamycin in a hand cream improves skin appearance and function. So they show a decrease in senescent cells. They show a very marked improvement in the underlying tissue structures, including collagen reformation. So this is a potential way in to getting aging science accepted more widely. It's a bit sad, but it's cosmetic. People are going to notice and be very, very interested if you have a skin cream that actually works, rather than claiming that it may work. Okay, so mTOR inhibitors are functionally, systemically very interesting. They improve health across the board, but our route into the market might be through cosmetics and cosmeceuticals. But we actually need the future now. We can't just wait for skin creams to be widely adopted. We need things that have much wider clinical impact. And at the moment, with the situation we find ourselves in, improving immunity seems to me to be one of the most important avenues. And improving immunity with geroprotectors, drugs that tackle the underlying aging process to improve immune and whole body health. And there's also already evidence out there that these drugs can work. So statins, we all think of as lowering cholesterol, but they actually improve neutrophil function. They are geroprotectors. They help with improving the aging immune system. And Liz Sapir has shown that much better survival for 6 months after people being admitted to hospital with community-acquired pneumonia if they take statins. And in people admitted to intensive care units, a study looking at whether they were on bisphosphonates, which is given for osteoporosis, did much, much better than people with similar critical care requirements who did not take bisphosphonates prior to admission. mTOR inhibitors, so RTB101, which is the lead asset for Restore Bio, protects mice from a lethal dose of influenza, particularly relevant, incredibly relevant right now. So Joan Manick of Restore Bio has shared some data showing that in their phase 2b and phase 3 clinical trials, they had a 40% reduction in the incidence of lab-confirmed respiratory tract infections, including a halving of the incidence of coronavirus infections that were around at the time. Not SARS-CoV-2, because that wasn't around when they were doing these trials, but multiple different coronaviruses. So it's very, very important that we get the message out there now that these drugs are active, they're functional. And if people are concerned that they read that Restore Bio's phase 3 clinical trial failed, essentially it was a failed trial, not a failed drug. The FDA changed the endpoint between phase 2b and phase 3, which did have, it introduced a lot of noise into the system, making the stats unwieldy, but the drug still had efficacy. Okay, so where are we? Where are we looking in the future? So I've mentioned senolytics and senomodifiers and geroprotectors and immune enhancers. But this is actually a very, very big business for investors and for people looking to the future as what might be happening in the aging space soon. So senolytics, particularly, I mentioned Unity. They've got a cap of 328 million at the moment. It really is a big business. The senomodifiers at the moment, mainly in the academic space, but Restore Bio, who currently have a market cap of 71.4 million, they're also, their drug is a senomodifier, as well as being a geroprotector and immune enhancer. Stem cells and regeneration, very, very interesting space. Agex are providing, well, will be providing off-the-shelf stem cells. Oxstem, a spin out from Oxford University, is looking at reprogramming our own body cells to become stem cells in vivo. And Ligenesis are looking at organ regeneration within the body. Gene therapies, so genetic engineering used to be science fiction, it's now science fact. Nightstar has just undergone a mergers and acquisitions for 848 million. This is big business because it's actually functional business. These are agents that work, that have positive impacts in the clinic. And then finally, biomarkers. In order to monitor whether any of these interventions actually work, we need biomarkers, not just for diagnosis of disease, but for prognosis and for therapeutic monitoring. And so there's a lot of movement in this space looking for biomarkers, and it was nice to see that a few of you here are already looking in biomarkers, multiple different types of biomarkers. So epigenetic biomarkers, plasma serum biomarkers, various different things. So essentially, that's me done. I'm going to thank the people in my lab and the various funders who supported the work, and just for a moment, put that screen back up. But I think you'll be able to access these afterwards if you're interested. Okay.
So Lynne, if I can start with one question for myself, and then
of course.
We've definitely got some questions coming in. So the first question is, how applicable is this to current pensioners? So over age 65, one bracket, over age 75, maybe another bracket.
Yeah, first thing, you're absolutely right to separate those age categories. It really annoys me in the aging data when you see 65 plus all bunched together. There's a huge health gradient as you go up incrementally. In terms of what is happening here and now and how applicable it is, the vast majority of people over the age of 65 already take statins. A lot of them take metformin. These are geroprotectors. A lot of them are taking bisphosphonates. They are drugs that are currently used in the clinic, but not used as geroprotectors. Although the data are now coming out showing that they can be useful in a wider sense. So bisphosphonates are not just for strengthening their bones, they actually improve your immune health. So there are drugs here and now that are being used. What I am hitting a brick wall with is and I'm trying to be diplomatic here, the acceptance that it's an appropriate thing to intervene in aging and age-related diseases, and B, the knowledge base of practitioners that there are agents already out there that can be used to intervene and improve overall health. So a lot of clinical medics who go into gerontology, geriatrics, simply seem to be unaware, and this is why we as scientists really need to be getting the message out, to be doing advocacy and saying there are drugs that you are currently using that you know are safe that ought to be rolled out more widely for the aging population. I don't know, did that answer your question?
It did, and I think a sort of linked question, if I can sort of draw you along that thought process, is how, I mean, you mentioned statins, you mentioned the bisphosphonates, how accessible and affordable are some of these drugs? And there's two flavors of that. There's sort of private wealth affordable, and then there's sort of government rollout accessible and affordable.
No, it's completely the right question. So it's interesting the number of people from Silicon Valley I've had conversations with. They're interested in some of the more future-gazing therapeutics that might have very big differences in terms of lifespan. So the stem cell therapies, the gene therapies, some of the slightly more future-looking things. There are some companies already out there offering telomerase gene therapy. As I said, I would urge major caution. One of them is charging £1 million to take part in a so-called clinical trial, injecting viral vectors, so viruses that express telomerase within your cells without any proven safety. So if you've got £1 million and you're in your 90s and you're worried about getting old, maybe, but I wouldn't recommend it. I think it's incredibly risky. That's not for the general public. The dasatinib and quercetin that I was talking about, they as individual doses are not entirely cheap. They're developed as cancer therapies, but in the aging space, you only need to use them every 6 months. So Jim Kirtland calls it a hit and run therapy. So you have one treatment, clears out the senescent cells, you've done your housekeeping for 6 months, your whole body regenerates and gets fitter and healthier. So a single dose therapeutic is actually very, very cheap. If you're looking at a course of a cancer therapy, then that becomes expensive. So people think that these drugs are expensive because of the dosing required and the time frame required. And then one final point on that, RTB101, originally developed as a cancer agent to be used at high dose. The dose used as a geroprotector and immune supportive agent is 1/120th of the maximum tolerated dose. It's a very, very low dose. And at those sorts of doses, it becomes affordable on a population level.
Thank you. So we've got a question from Keith Comito regarding COVID-19. So Keith, if you want to unmute yourself, or should I ask the question? Okay,
that's just one. I'm not happy. Well, no, Ethan, but that's just one show. And let's just drop it then.
Oh, Keith, shall I Keith, are you able to?
That the board knows what it's doing.
No, I'm going to ask Keith's question for him. So the question I've got here is, does COVID-19 present an opportunity to this sector in terms of bringing attention to immune boosting drugs?
Very much so. Now, I mean, it's a huge tragedy that we have to come to a point where thousands, potentially millions of older people are dying of an infectious disease before we realize that we need to do something about it. I have two avenues to this. One is the drug interventions. If we can get acceptance and use of the geroprotectors and immune supportive drugs in a COVID world and they show efficacy, I think that could be the the foot in the door that the field has needed for many, many years. But what COVID has also shown is that we actually have some structural problems. I know there's people from other countries as well as the UK here, but I think across the board, the care sector really needs some structural reorganisation. We need to think about how we look after the most vulnerable people. So I've got some quite radical ideas on generating a national care service that integrates with the National Health Service. That's not drugs, but that would actually have a major impact. And it's something that on the back of COVID, there might be a public appetite for, whereas pre-COVID, people put older people away in care homes, shut the door, and maybe didn't want to think too much about it. But yeah, I completely agree that the tragedy of COVID may be the making of the geroprotector and immune supportive field. So geroscience has a huge part to play. And one final thing on that, we are desperately trying to get drugs into clinical trials for COVID because we have proven efficacy of immune supportive function. They went through triage with Public Health England and have been put to the top of the list. At the moment, we haven't heard back on whether they are going into full-blown clinical trials. I just worry that all the decision making, I know it has to be done properly, but it takes a long time. And in the meantime, people are dying. So that's my take on it. I'm a bit of an advocate for using geroprotectors against COVID. Everyone's gone quiet.
Sorry, I put myself on mute there. Yeah. I'm sure we'll come back to COVID, but we've got a question from Sasha.
Hi there, Lynn. Just before I ask my question, I just want to say, recognise your comments on care, and I think you're absolutely right. I think there will be an increased appetite to discuss resolving care. That's certainly sort of the views of some of the people in the actuarial profession I'm talking to. So I think you're right. We might finally see some appetite there. I had a question. My question was relating to sort of polypharmacy in the sense that it seems to me, from what I read, is that there will be a number of drugs tackling different things. And maybe one or two of them or more will have significant effects, but actually what we're going to potentially need is you would benefit from taking all of them. So that raises two questions. Is that being explored or investigated or researched? Because there are questions about polypharmacy and the lack of research in that area, even with today's sort of treatments. And are there any reasons to believe that couldn't happen, but actually if you take this drug, you can't take that drug, etc., etc.?
Okay, yeah, that's an incredibly good question. So an example of potentially dangerous polypharmacy from the Restore Bio data, we know that if you take digoxin, you shouldn't be taking RTB 101 because there are drug interactions. An awful lot of drugs can't be taken if you are on agents that impact on metabolism of drugs in the liver, because obviously they can increase the concentration of the drugs in the bloodstream. Anyone who takes statins is probably aware of grapefruit juice being an issue. That's polypharmacy. People don't think about it as polypharmacy, but drug interactions or drug metabolite interactions are very important. And we do know that iatrogenic illness, which is a polite way of saying the doctor gave you the problem, is actually most of it is due to polypharmacy, and our whole way of treating age-related diseases is to put them into separate silos. So someone with cardiovascular disease goes to see a specialist. If you then have cancer on top, you'll see an oncologist. You've got chronic kidney disease, you see a renal specialist. And what happens, all these specialists are fantastic at knowing what drugs work for their illness, but not necessarily about how they all interact in one person. And there have been cases where some older people are on 20 or more different medications and have been diagnosed with dementia, and it's simply a case of the polypharmacy causing them delirium. So there are major problems currently with polypharmacy because we silo different diseases of aging rather than having a more holistic approach to them. So polypharmacy at the moment is bad. It may be good because there may be synergistic activities between some of these different anti-aging therapeutics. But one thing that we're looking at is you can't think of aging as one disease, and you can't even look at aging cells as being caused by one particular biochemical change. So with cancer or with well, let's take SARS-CoV-2. People are thinking in terms of treating by hitting one particular causative molecule, a driver of that disease. But in aging, multiple different things change all at the same time. So you can't just take an inhibitor of one protein and expect it to work. What you need is a gentle modulation of the entire system, which is where what you're talking about, polypharmacy, comes in, but we're thinking of it in terms of polypharmacology. So we take one drug, like statins, which actually have multiple different impacts within the cell and the body. And polypharmacology may be beneficial, whereas polypharmacy may be detrimental because of the drug-drug interactions. Does that address your question?
Yes, it confirms that, that we should be worrying about it, but actually people are worrying about it, which is
good. There's been some costings done. I can't remember the figures off the top of my head, but it is billions it costs to the UK health sector every year from adverse drug interactions through polypharmacy. Plus the ill health it causes. I mean, the quality of life problems. Looks like Mark has a question. Sorry, Sue.
Yes, thank you, Lynn. Yeah, thanks, great presentation. I guess my question is sort of related to the last one, actually. I'm always worried about, and I guess there's a worry in society about the long-term impact. So it's quite hard to do a clinical trial that lasts more than about a couple of years or whatever.
Yeah.
So I was actually wondering then, with the examples you gave of statin and metformin that have actually been out there and people have been taking them for 20 years or longer, whether there have been any studies which try to say the long-term impact of metformin, even for those who don't have diabetes, or it may be positive, or maybe there's some worries about polypharmacy or whatever, and the same for statins, really.
Yeah. Okay. Well, let's start with metformin. So Nir Barzilai has been on the Longevity Leaders thing. I don't know how many of you actually watched his presentations. Nir has been looking at metformin as a geroprotector for quite some time, and he's actually been a pioneer in trying to get the FDA to change the regulatory framework to allow multiple different age-related diseases as endpoints for clinical trials. So a mixed endpoint, rather than having to say, I have a drug that will treat diabetes, I will have a drug that treats cardiovascular disease. So he has set up the TAME trial treating aging with metformin. They were in recruitment, and of course COVID has slowed everything down somewhat. But Nir finally got the FDA to agree to a mixed endpoint in an age-related trial based on retrospective data mining of people who've been taking metformin for many, many years, and showing that even those who are not diabetic show improved health on metformin treatment. Metformin, it's okay. Metformin is Nir's baby, and I think it could be incredibly useful. There are a few hesitancies about dosing with metformin. In the interventions testing program, feeding it to mice, there was a beneficial effect on lifespan and health at one particular dose. Up the dose a little bit and it actually decreased health and lifespan. So there's quite a narrow therapeutic window as a geroprotector. Some of the mTOR inhibitors at very low dose look extremely promising. So statins, yes, they've been in use for so long now. And the study I showed you, Lysape's study, was based on some retrospective data analysis from the Queen Elizabeth Hospital in Birmingham. They have completely digital records, so they can actually conduct data mining experiments quite quickly. And Janet Lord had the thought that statins impact on neutrophil function. Those are professional immune cells of the innate immune system. And so she got a grad student within 48 hours to data mine back, looking at the outcomes of patients who came in on statins and those who didn't. And the ones who came in already taking statins had a better outcome from serious illness. And that led to the clinical trial that Liz Sapie led, where people coming in with community-acquired pneumonia were given statins at the point of admission. And 6 months later, they had So they had less organ failure and sepsis on the acute illness, but they also survived longer on a 6-month follow-up. So you can use retrospective data sets, you can data mine, and you may or may not have seen Ben Goldacre's paper, I think it's still in bioRxiv, about data mining for COVID and risk factors, and going through what people are currently taking and what their outcomes are and what their previous health conditions are. So there's one program called Decovid looking at data sets, and another one is using UK Biobank data. So AI and technology are going to be incredibly important for this data mining to find out retrospectively whether we can work out what's good for you, what's not good for you, and also what interactions may be good or bad. Does that answer your question? I know I bumble on a bit.
No, that's great. That's great. And I was thinking of the Ben Goldacre work.
Oh, you were right. I saw you smile when I mentioned that.
And whether that same sort of data, can be used for this sort of thing, because obviously it has great statistical power.
Yeah, indeed.
Yeah, thank you.
Sud, you're on mute.
Thank you. Yeah, I've done it again. Sorry, Anthony Williamson. Do you want to ask your question on healthspan?
I just have a question as to whether therapeutically you can separate longevity from healthspan, because people, it's easy to get people on board improving or extending healthspan, but longevity is a little different.
Yeah, I completely agree, Anthony. It's extremely easy to sell improved health span to whatever audience you talk to, whether it's school kids on a school's question time or the House of Lords. And you can imagine that they've got quite a bit of a personal interest in this. They're not necessarily the youngest people. Health span, definitely. Ultra longevity, and there are some people in this field who, and Jose, I know that you're actually quite keen on this idea, eliminating death. I'm much more keen on the idea of eliminating disease, or at least compressing the period of your life which you spend in serious chronic disease. So that's called compression of morbidity. And I'm not a proponent for massively extending lifespan, but if you get rid of the diseases that kill older people, they will inevitably have more lifespan, but it'll be lifespan spent in health, so they're economically active, they're socially active, and we will have to rethink, if these drugs really do what we think they're going to do, we're going to have to rethink pension ages, we're going to have to rethink employment. So Andrew Scott's got a book out, The 100-Year Life, which is a very interesting read, looking at how our whole structures of life may need to adapt if we really do have better health throughout the life course. There's so many pension people nodding as I said that, but it is a really, really important point. You can't have people retiring at 65 if they're going to stay in good health till 85.
And so from a therapeutic perspective, though, do you think you can reap the benefits of improved health span without a significant increase in longevity? Okay, I'm going to turn the question back to you. Define significant. Yeah, so if health span doesn't increase by, or lifespan doesn't increase by more than 5 years, but you have a really meaningful improvement in later year health. Yeah, so that's my point on compression and morbidity. So you may see maybe a 5-10 year increase in overall lifespan. At the moment, actually, we spend, the data have changed. It used to be about 11 to 13 years in poor health at the end of life. It's now more like 23 years for women in the most deprived areas. So about a quarter of your life in ill health. If we compress that morbidity to, say, the last 3 to 5 years of life, I'm pretty sure it will have the longevity dividend that I mentioned at the beginning, so an extension of lifespan. But I can't imagine, unless we have some very major interventions, like replacing all your stem cells, that it's going to be much more than that. There's some data, again, from Nearby Zillai's studies. He looks at supercentenarians. There's a small group of Ashkenazi Jewish people in New York who are living 110, 115, quite happy and healthy. They die, but they die healthy. And what they tend to die of
it appears to be, they run out of stem cells. So simply, we have a finite number of cells and cell divisions we can go through. So with normal senolytic medications and everything else, I think there will still be a finite limit to lifespan. It's when you start intervening and regenerating organs and replacing stem cells that you might see some longer longevity. It depends if you want to go that route.
Okay, great. Thank you.
Okay, let's move to Mark. He's got a question on clinical trials.
Thank you. That was a really great presentation. I just wanted to check back on your comment about, I think it was RTB 101 being in phase 2 to 3 trials. And just to confirm my understanding that the only drug that's in phase 1 trials for, this multiple endpoint sort of success is metformin, and so presumably these other trials are targeting particular diseases. And is that because it's easier to get approved and then branch into, oh, actually this is can be useful for anti-aging, as opposed to getting approved for the business of delaying aging?
Yeah, it's predominantly the regulatory issues. It's an awful lot easier to get the FDA to agree if you say, I am going to treat a disease that is a recognized disease in the World Health Organization classification of disease. They are moving slightly towards, in that disease classification, towards age-related diseases, not aging per se, but it's extremely difficult to get approval for mixed endpoints. NIR was a pioneer in this. It's the only trial I know of that has that. So James Payer, who's also been presenting this week, he has an example from cancer biology where if you have an agent that is effective against one particular cancer, you get approval for it. And then you test that agent in a different type of cancer, and it works, and you get approval. And then you test it in a third different type of cancer with a different driver altogether, and it still works, you get approval. And at that point, you can turn around to the FDA and say, this isn't just a drug for bone cancer or blood cancer or whatever, it is an anti-cancer drug. And then it's a lot easier to get approvals if you've gone indication by indication. And this is also, I think, the strategy of Unity Biotech. They're going for particular indications like osteoarthritis or diabetic retinopathy for two very clever reasons. One is the regulatory thing, and the other one is safety. So you go for confined compartments. So they're injecting into the knee compartment, they're injecting into the eye. If you do see any adverse consequences, it's a contained problem. Because the other thing that we risk in this field is moving too fast with an agent that may have detrimental consequences. And a bit like gene therapy 20 years ago, when one of the 18-year-old participants in the safety study actually died for a test of cystic fibrosis therapy, it set the field back so far. There was a moratorium on a lot of studies. So I think it's the gently approach that is going to get us through the regulatory authorities.
Slightly off piece, but on clinical trials and COVID-19,
yeah.
So Oxford were sort of quite openly in the press about doing some clinical trials. What's the timelines on
that? Recovery remarkably started yesterday, even though it's been in the planning for, well, since the beginning. So we proposed a clinical trial. When did we put the application in? 12th of March. And I can't say too much about it, but we only found out yesterday, day before, a request for further information on that. So in terms of clinical trials, these things are moving incredibly quickly. In terms of need in current circumstances, I would like a little bit more agility. But you have to be careful. You can't give drugs to people that might make them worse rather than better, although I have reservations about hydroxychloroquine, but that's another matter. Clinical trials have to be done rigorously and properly, and they have to be properly assessed by experts in the field, and it does take time. But I think some of the lessons we've learned with COVID is the need for speed, and I hope that as we move forwards out of this, clinical trials, designs, approvals and regulation might be a little bit speedier than they have been historically.
Okay, on those references to Top Gun, I'm going to pass you to John Housley. Oh, sorry, John.
You're mute.
It's refusing to unmute. So a lot of my question was answered in your question from Anthony. But I was going to say, with the geroprotectants that we know about at the moment, a lot of them have a lifespan extending effect as well.
Yeah.
Do any of them really have a robust compression of the late, like, poor health? So it's really easy when you're compiling data of those drugs to show that there is a point compared to the control when they are more healthy. But of course, if you're just moving that point of poor health, it doesn't help.
Exactly. So when the Harrison paper came out in 2009, I was asked to do an editorial on it. So I saw some of the data that weren't generally out there. And one of my big questions was, what do the mice die of? Do they essentially have you just shifted that whole lifespan curve? So my very first slide, you haven't changed the gradient of aging at all. Have you just extended the period that they're alive rather than the period that they're healthy? And that is, to me, the crux of the question. With the rapamycin original feeding study, it looked like they died of the same things that mice normally die of, and the gradients of the lifespan curves were pretty much the same. There have been some subsequent studies looking at improvement of health, and again with rapamycin showing improved health and potentially compression and morbidity. The real issue is doing this in people. It takes too long. So you have to try and do it in experimental organisms. Like I said, we work on worms and flies. A lot of people, and you're yeast, aren't you? So things that have a short lifespan, but we have a problem with knowing how applicable that is to humans. So obviously my studies are potentially more informative than worms and flies and yeast, but we don't know because we're not mice. We have some data from worms that we can compress morbidity quite significantly, so we can almost square that curve. Whether that pans out in human populations, I really don't know. The only human data I know of are the supercentenarian studies of neobacilli and centenarian studies. People are looking at what's different between centenarians, i.e. they're people who have avoided the diseases of later life to become centenarians, because otherwise they'd be dead. And they seem to express, neobacilli again has been looking at plasma proteomics of this, and they're seeing about 28 things in centenarians that aren't present in non-centenarians. So that might give us a clue as to how to overcome morbidity, how to compress morbidity. But I don't think we've got an answer to that at the moment.
Thank you.
Okay, I think we've got a question from Barry Sharples. He's not asked one yet, and then if we've got time, we're going to go back to Keith Comito.
Thank you. Lynne, you mentioned the TAME.
Barry, you're a little bit quiet. Could you speak up or put your volume up, please?
I will speak up. Lynne, you mentioned the TAME trial and FDA, and just touched on what you mentioned about cancer and the different types of cancer. I know with the FDA you can apply under what's called a basket application for cancer, and we've got nothing like that for aging, which it would be very useful if we did. Now, you also mentioned the industrial strategy of the UK of extending healthy life by 5 years by 2035. In that report as well, it talks about a multifactorial approach to medicine, which is what we are looking for, especially with aging, when you're looking at all the different aspects of aging. But there's a disconnect with the government in terms of that policy and the regulator, because if the MHRA won't look at a multifactorial approach, how is the government going to get an extra 5 years of healthy life? So it's something that we do. It's systemic, it's multifactorial, it affects inflammation, senescence, mitochondrial failure, a whole host of age-related and degenerative disease. So, you know, we're doing exactly what everybody else seems to be doing, and approaching individual indications, which we're doing CGMP manufacture at the moment for our first clinical trial. And we've strategically chosen one with the pathology is spread across many other diseases. So that's the approach we've used. And it's almost as if we're having to shoe on the future of medicine into an archaic method of measuring the effects of medicine. So I was wondering if you'd actually, how much information you'd got from the MHRA and how receptive they are today, or are they becoming receptive on something that would benefit many different aspects of aging as opposed to just one disease?
Yeah, I completely get that. And I think their mindsets are starting to change. I mean, we were hoping that TAME would go ahead and show wonderful outcomes, and then that would be the game changer. But in terms of umbrella and basket, you didn't mention basket trials, but trials where you can test multiple different agents all at the same time against one indication, or test one agent against multiple indications. Those sorts of trials are now being approved by MHRA. So Chris Buckley, who's got a joint appointment in Oxford and Birmingham, he's looking for arthritis, and he's doing a lot of these types of trials. So there is some flexibility within that framework. Now, in terms of the more difficult question of regulation, I can see that George turned his camera on, and George has a direct line into government, so he's probably in a much better position to answer that question in terms of how we fulfill government's aims of 5 years extra healthy life by 2035 in a regulatory framework that is holding us back. So I know, Sue, you're in charge, but can we bring George in for comments on this?
Just finally, Lynne, just to finish off, hopefully Microgen will appear on your graph next year as well.
Yeah, okay.
Because clearly there's a missing link there, and that's something that the way that we're approaching is quite unique. When we look at everybody else at the longevity conference, we are doing something very, very different to everyone else.
Brilliant.
And I'm a patient. And I'm a patient. I've been a patient since 2012.
Should we bring George in now? Just because we're running over slightly. Sorry.
Yeah. So it's just on the edge of my competence, if you like. My first comment is really the 2035 target is really quite ambitious, and my focus is really on the societal changes that can have an impact. And I've argued, I think, persuaded by Lynne and others, that actually the 2035 is not helpful in terms of thinking about new therapeutical interventions and when they can come in. I was going to ask a question actually on specifically what are the sort of premature aspects of aging where therapeutics actually, and I don't think it's just an MHRA issue. I think it's going to be a NICE issue, and why would government pay for it? And for me, you know, if there's premature aging, if there's a cogent logic as to what you're doing with people, then it'd be much easier to make a sort of an economic case for funding people than saying let's try and sort of put off aging altogether. But so I think these two things need to move together. What I would say, allied with COVID, is we've actually seen MHRA move at a speed which is sort of unbelievable, you know, on ventilators, on drug trials. I know Sir Mark is personally involved in, Sir Mark Walport, the Chief Executive of UKRI, personally involved in leading this next wave of drug trials, so pulling through therapeutics showing promise. And it's really an indication of when you move away from business as usual into an urgent need, then government will move. And I was encouraged. So the all-party parliamentary group was discussing this last week. Dominic Grieve thinks that regulatory reform is an area where the UK could really sort of do well in terms of promoting its science, and getting the benefits for the early stage, basic research that we're generating, and move that into an economic benefit as well. So, not a straightforward answer to what you're saying, but I am encouraged by the speed with which things have changed and what that is telling government. It is difficult for government to make decisions at the speed that it's trying to make. But I'm really encouraged, for instance, at the way the vaccines manufacturing is now looking not just at getting new vaccines sort of approved through thing, but actually how do we pull that whole thing through into the population. And we're really hopeful that we'll have facilities that are available much faster than they were planned, and they were planned, and at a scale and volume much faster than was ever planned.
Yeah.
So,
yeah. I mean, I'm actually, I might be a bit frustrated because we're just hoping to get drugs into people because we see people dying. I'm working with clinicians who run care homes and who are on the pulmonary ward and obviously have patients dying of COVID. But we do appreciate that everything is, I hate to use the Trump phrase, but moving at warp speed, that it's actually going so much faster than we'd ever expected. George, I want to come in very briefly on your point on premature aging. I think it's a huge selling point in terms of cancer patients who are treated either with radiotherapy or with drugs that damage their DNA, so genotoxic agents, undergo highly premature aging. So children who are survivors of leukemia actually age very fast. So in their 30s, they're aging the way that you would expect someone in their 50s or 60s. So we have premature aging in the population already. And diabetes is a disease of premature aging. HIV appears to be a disease of premature aging. I was at a meeting at the Royal Society of Medicine where it was pointed out that HIV patients seem to have old age diseases maybe 20 years earlier than you'd expect. So we have whole cohorts of the population who would greatly benefit from treatments that can either protect them against the onset of premature aging or treat once it's happened. And the National Cancer Institute in America has just got a paper out, I think it's preprint or it's just been accepted, Gita Campisi is an author on it, looking at using these geroprotectors to help in people having cancer therapy so that they don't get cell senescence, so they don't have all those detrimental changes that will lead to early onset of age-related diseases. So you're absolutely right. It's not just aging as in 65, 75, 85 plus. There are huge numbers of the population who are much younger who are also aging. So I think that that's a population that we really ought to be focusing on as well.
So, Lynne, I'm going to...
Yeah, no, I've gone over time.
Look, we're 7 minutes over, but look, it's been an amazing presentation, amazing engagement, good debate, great debate. Thank you, everyone, and we'll probably close it here if that's okay.